Ciao, one and all. Ciao, which I understand it can be hello or goodbye in Italian. We're looking at an Italian figure, although he would not call himself Italian, he would call himself Nepalese. We're looking at Giambattista Vico and his new science. Before we get to Vico, I am John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. And indeed, we are looking at Thunderclaps on Vico's new science. This is class 4 of 10 of our Sons of Issachar historical cycles course here at the Institute. And we're going to do a brief recap as I get everything squared away here. We're going to get into the name of this class, Thunderclaps, in the course of our introductory remarks here for the next hour or thereabouts, and then we will break for private seminar, and between then and now we will have the screen share. Of course, the opening music was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I think appropriate to the image. Could listen to that all day. Okay, so Thunderclaps is our title here. We have a lightning strike, and from lightning comes thunder with the sound there rolling. If children are to be believed, what is it? 1 mile a second if you count away from the thunder. That's how far the storm is. So many seconds away is so many miles away. That was always the rule of thumb as a child, wasn't it? Okay, so this is our cycles class, and we are class number 4. So very briefly, at the bottom of the page, you can see where we've come from, where we're going. And at the end of our seminar section of this privately, we will also touch on next week. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Our first class was looking at perennialist and Abrahamic conceptions, as well as what is memory and what is history. We then moved on to St. Augustine's City of God, a landmark text in historiography, where Augustine attempts to provide a universal history, not just for the Hebrews or for his own religion, which saw itself as a continuation of that tradition and the perfection of that tradition, but also of the Romans. So in a sense, the non-Christian world, the pre-Christian world. We moved last week, as of this broadcast, to Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. We looked at this introduction, which is what the word means, to Khaldun's look at life, a little bit less providential, a little bit more rational, if we would use that language, or sociological. Hard to shake that, especially in the Quran, where you have the constant mention of piety and community obligation, and Ibn Khaldun himself being a jurist. So all of that plays a role. It's a different outlook in certain ways than St. Augustine. And his whole idea of asabiya, social cohesion, coming together or falling apart, which contributes to his theory of history. And in fact, in various ways, all of these topics will play a role in Giambattista Vico's view of history. You know, in our day, we have nearly endless access to information. What we're losing very quickly is the organization of that information. And part of being educated in the true sense of the word is not so much knowing a lot, but being able to pull various thinkers from the past and integrate things and shift gears is another simile that might be helpful. So, 4 weeks in now, we're asking ourselves, well, who is right? Well, in a sense, we might want to shift gears depending on the time and place as to what scholar may inform the hour that we might be studying or might be living in. This is education, being able to realize that different people can have aspects of the right interpretation. And Vico, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but Vico recognizes that. That's what we might say is one of his unique aspects. St. Augustine has his unique aspect of providence and the universal history. Ibn Khaldun had his asabiya. What is the unique thing to Giambattista Vico is recognizing that different communities at different times will have different keys. If again, you have to forgive me with all the similes. We're just trying to make parallels. Different keys to unlock the mystery of this civilization's development or decline compared to that. Get used to it. When we get to Arnold Toynbee, he's going to have dozens of possibilities as to how this happens. So coming attractions there, we'll get teed off with Vico today, but not that you need to see my mug, but why not get in on the action here? Let me get the head here queued up. There we go. All right. This is right. This is adding so much to the to the class here. All right. So lightning strikes. We're going to be looking at this here, but let's make our way across the tabs, having done our rundown. And by the way, next week we're really skipping ahead to Samuel Benner and the Benner prophecies. But we'll look at that in the second half here. So Giambattista Vico, born on the 23rd of June, 1668, and casting this mortal coil after a good long life, looks like almost 80 years, dying in 1744. And the grandfather of the tie is this sort of ribbon thing that you see, very popular in that hour. Very interesting to see an Italian wearing such a thing. We would associate this look often with the Puritans here in America, where I'm broadcasting from. They had the similar thing. Same in France, so obviously it was a fashion across the board, as was long hair, incidentally. We are looking at this man, and I thought it very appropriate, this contender for being one of the dozens of the fathers of history. There was a gentleman years ago, a young fella, in fact, Stephen was his first name. He had a fascination with chronology and alternative chronologies like flamenco. His second name is escaping me now. I think he's very, very ill with cancer. May God give him health. But Stephen, where was I going with Stephen there? Anyhow, it'll come back to me. Anyhow, I wanted to anchor Giambattista in Naples, Italy. And this is a beautiful photograph of modern Naples. You can see it looks like a very fun place, very Mediterranean in more ways than one. You'd not have this sort of architecture, much less the painting on the outside of the buildings up here in North America so much. I think if you paint your house brown, they start giving you stink eye. Forget about orange and purple and things. But in any case, where was I going? Why did I mention Stephen? Anyway, on Naples, I did want to anchor the beginning of our treatment of Vico in his place of origin. And that here is Naples. So you see southern Italy. It probably is not coming up so easily with the color distinction, but this is the south of Italy. And you can see that Giambattista, he's living in, let's say, these 17th into the 18th centuries. And he's living in the south of Italy. And this man who writes a book called Scienza Nova, or the New Science, it struck me as living in a place that saw at least 3 full cycles of civilizations come and go. So how interesting that this scholar would come from here. And I just remembered why I mentioned Stephen, the father of history. I'm going to get back to that point. Forgive me for losing the train of thought there. It eventually comes back. Southern Italy in the ancient world obviously saw a heavy colonization by Greece. In fact, this area is known as Magna Graecia. And even to this day, you can see the artifacts of Greek colonization in the south. In many ways, in architecture in the ancient world, the Romans had to bump up against this. The phalanx system, the language, to say nothing of the language, which goes on to influence later Latin. But the point is, Giambattista lives in an area where it saw the flowering of Greek culture. This was basically living space, shall we say, for Greek colonists, the south of Italy. Obviously, in its time, Rome came, conquered, set up shop, and then collapsed. And then finally, closer to Vico's day, finally, we have the Naval Republic of Naples, joining people like the Venetians and some other of these Adriatic trading empires. We tend to pay much less attention in mainstream history to the maritime republics of Italy, but these were very influential in their day. They were cutting edge. They were cutting edge until Christopher Columbus. And, eventually Greece is captured after internal squabbles by the Romans. Eventually Rome collapses because of its arguably excessive commitments all over the place, colonially speaking and militarily speaking. And then what happens with the Republic of Naples, closer to Vico's day, is that, well, actually, two things happen. One of which is Constantinople falls. The other is Christopher Columbus finds, trade routes and so forth in the New World. And all of that means that the Kingdom of Naples, along with Venice and so forth, went from being, even within a century prior to Vico's birth, went from being the center of the world, so to speak, in terms of commerce. Think of the Renaissance and all of this stuff. To all of a sudden whipsawing, the center of activity whipsawing to Northwestern Europe. A hot second there with Portugal and Spain, but then, it's solidly France, Holland, England, right? These become the great new maritime powers. So to Vico, you can imagine why such a man would have a historical consciousness. And we always want to anchor our scholars in their life and times. These ideas don't just come down from the ether. They come oftentimes from men thinking about the circumstances of their day. We saw that with St. Augustine and the Visigoths and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in his time. We saw that with Ibn Khaldun and his meditation on the Berbers and on the collapse of early Islam and different trends he was noticing. And likewise, we can identify the same with Vico, not once or twice, but thrice, seeing this cycle of civilization on the very land that he's living at and seeing the artifacts of that. Although I don't know if they had quite the zesty painting scheme in his day. But you are tripping over history there. All right. And indeed, this leads to Vico spending a little bit shy of 25 years chipping away at this project. And as any writer can tell you, it's often hard to know when to put down the pen, especially after you spend a long time with the project. In a recent broadcast on the Never-Ending Story, we likened the fiction writer's tale to a child, and the same can be true for nonfiction. It's just a matter of spending a long time with something. It takes on a life of its own, we would say, and it's hard to leave that. And the same here. So this is a project that Vico would spend decades of his life on. Now, before we get to the specifics of the new science, we have to understand Vico as something of an anti-Enlightenment figure. And before I dive into this, I want to just tie up my scatterbrain earlier. I mentioned a man called Stephen and his work with chronology. But I remember Stephen in some of our episodes years ago, he brought that up, that there were many, many people who claimed to be, or were claimed to be in the passive tense. They were claimed to be the father of history, whether that's Herodotus. In fact, the people we've looked at in this series could all plausibly be, quote unquote, the father of history. Herodotus, St. Augustine, Ibn Khaldun. Today, Vico is an example of another father of history. And they each contribute something groundbreaking. We'll get to Vico. This is René Descartes, by the way. We're going to get to him in a hot second. But you might have noticed we've jumped ahead some. We jumped ahead from St. Augustine to Ibn Khaldun, and from Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, now to Vico in the, let's say, 18th century. And Ibn Khaldun is from a different culture. Within the West, that means we've jumped from St. Augustine, class number 2, now class number 4. We've jumped from the 5th century to now the 18th century. We've jumped 1,300 years. And in terms of Western historiography, you say, that's quite a leap, John. And so it is. But we do want to understand 2 points to understand this leap. Right? We're jumping in the West from St. Augustine to Vico. As we read in the New Science, Vico, kind of lumps the Muslims with various so-called pagan groups. He has a certain ethnocentricity, which is perfectly of the time. But how could it be justified to jump from the 5th century to the 13th, or rather to the 18th, jumping 13 centuries? Well, arguably, one, St. Augustine's historiography basically prevails, as does his theology, throughout much of that time. Secondarily, though, what you see during the medieval period is almost a decomposition in terms of historical consciousness, and that can be excused because of the times as well, especially the so-called Dark Ages of the early medieval period are chaotic, with not just Islamic invasions in the south, in Italy and Spain, but also probably much more violently, even and more chaotically, the Vikings in the north, all throughout the north of Europe, coming down and destroying monasteries and settlements. And none of this is good for knowledge transmission. And so, understandably, history also takes, the historical discipline, as we might phrase it, takes a back seat. And you see a certain devolution happening. And so you see the rise during the medieval times between Augustine and Vico. You see the rise of the Chronicle. The Chronicle is it's much more like what you would see in the Roman or the Greek world, where it's just isolated snapshots of historical events without much of an attempt to string them together in any sort of interpretive fashion. So we do see a step back there. So that would also explain, one of which is the predominance of just Augustinian thinking. So that's the city of God and all of that view in history, but also just the reality that things kind of take a backseat and they become much more like Plutarch or Livy, where you're just doing these snapshots of, this whale died this year, this guy became king this year, this battle was fought this year. Why Vico once again can be considered one of a number of quote-unquote fathers of history, is the fact that here we are back on the wagon, early modern period, back on the wagon, and now we're trying to come up with a unified theory of history. Before we get to that theory, I did want to say a few words as regards Vico being an anti-Enlightenment figure. And he's often contrasted with René Descartes, who is this fabulously ugly gentleman from France here, and a strange character in his own day. But it's simply enough as a snapshot to use Descartes as a way to understand the Enlightenment. So if Vico is this anti-Enlightenment figure, what do we mean by the Enlightenment? So placing Vico and roughly Descartes at the same time, we're seeing Vico's born in 1668. So this is immediately after the Wars of Religion. So in the meantime, you see Christianity has entered into the Reformation, and therefore the wars of religion, this tug of war, on a, shall we say, a psychological level. We can see that basically Christianity, as I've laid out several times in this class, ancient and medieval Christianity is basically a synthesis of the Hebrew mythology, and I don't mean that's made up stories necessarily, but the Hebrew, what is mythology for a historian? Mythology does not mean a made up story. A myth for a historian does not mean it's false. A myth academically means a story that has power for a group of people. I want to be very clear with that. So for instance, in America, when George Washington crosses the Delaware on St. Stephen's Day after Christmas in 1776, that is a myth. It is a story about circumstances and a last-ditch attempt to get the attention of the French, and to score something like a victory. That is a myth, and yet, by all accounts, this event happened, that George Washington captured, and his troops captured, a lot of drunk Hessians the day after Christmas. It is both historically true and mythologically true. And so when we say that Christianity, Vico and Descartes, is they're both living in a sense, the ashes of Christendom. Prior to that, again, this is all is influencing the idea of cycles that we're going to see with Vico. Prior to that, you had European Christianity being the merger of the Hebraic mythology and the whole Bible stories, and this idea of discourse, rationality, categorical philosophy. These two streams come together, and the Teutonic, which is another discussion, into Christianity. All of that gets blown up at the Reformation, and what you see is basically what continues as Catholic or Protestant Christianities is kind of that Hebraic strain. And then what is that culture of the classical world? How does that continue? Well, that becomes the Enlightenment. That becomes, super rationality, and that's your Descartes. That's your René Descartes, and so we speak of Cartesian philosophy, and as a nutshell, we say, I think, therefore I am, or if you're a Latin nerd, you can toss around the Latin expression cogito ergo sum, which is just that. I think, cogito, I think, ergo, therefore, thusly, I am. And long story short, René Descartes is asking himself, after the Reformation, after allegedly, you can't put your trust in faith claims because they lead to violence, and nobody can agree on any of this anyway. Just look at the past 100 years. If you're coming out of this Enlightenment tradition, claims to faith, claims to divinely instituted churches and books and saints and so forth, all of that's undermined. So if you're in the Enlightenment, you're asking, well, what can I hang my epistemology on? What can I hang being on? How do I know any of this is real? It seems in the 18th century, Christianity has folded like a house of cards. They can't even agree amongst themselves, and this leads to skepticism. It leads to rationality. And how do I know anything is true? Rene Descartes is going to say. Now, Vico is going to disagree with this very much, but Descartes is going to say that's going to be through sense perception. I see things. I hear things. I can debate things, and so forth. So, in a nutshell, I know that's not the full breadth and depth of the man, but the point is, Vico is often contrasted to this whole Enlightenment tradition. All right, and still playing around a little bit with ChatGPT. Just a few words here, and then we're going to get into specifically Vico's understanding, which makes much more allowance as a good anti-Enlightenment or contra-Enlightenment thinker. Vico makes much more of an allowance towards myth, and we will see that in a helpful schema coming up. But still playing around indeed with that ChatGPT, very scary. I just had to type in how did Giambattista Vico and Rene Descartes look at historiography differently. Thankfully, it did not try to flatter me this week. But we read that a few things here. So Descartes sees history as unreliable and non-scientific knowledge as unreliable as well. And also with Descartes and the Enlightenment tradition, notice that even the word science is going to have a very limited meaning. Whereas you can see Vico literally with his book, La Scienza Nuova, he's going to apply the word science, or simply knowledge from Latin, to basically what we would call the humanities. Notice that in the predominant rising Enlightenment tradition, science becomes limited simply to quantifiable matter, basically, and quantifiable, physical observations about matter. Okay, so for Descartes, history depends on testimony, memory, sensory evidence, cogito ergo sum, all of which are fundamentally unreliable. I mean, Descartes will take it to the part that all that you can possibly know is that you are thinking, which leads off to basically liberalism, a capital L liberalism, the idea that the individual is the sole measure of reality, of which arguably we're now at the logical conclusion in the 21st century, where I can just assert that I am a reality because I see myself as a reality, and therefore it is taken to be valid. Descartes goes on, therefore, history cannot reach the rigorous certainty of mathematical or philosophical truths. Descartes often saw history as useful for moral examples, but not as a secure foundation for science. Methodologically, Descartes promotes methodic doubt, which cuts against trusting inherited historical accounts. In brief, Descartes sees history as inferior to philosophical or scientific knowledge because it lacks certainty. It is too contingent, empirical, and dependent on human error. For Vico, history is the foundation of human knowledge. So that is the radical opposite. So in the epistemology of Vico, that epistemology is that level of philosophy where we study how we know what we know. His central principle is verum ipsum factum. The truth is precisely what is made. Humans can know with certainty that what they themselves have created. And this includes history, culture, institutions, and language. We are not a mystery to ourselves. His view of history is that history is not inferior to science or natural science, we might say. It is the proper domain of human knowledge. So notice that Vico has a much more broader definition of science than the Enlightenment curtails it as. History is the proper domain of human knowledge because human worlds are man-made. Vico criticized Descartes for trying to force mathematical certainty onto human affairs. He argued that understanding history involves imaginative reconstruction, philology, that is the study of words. I think, for instance, last week in our private class, we had looked at the Latin word for money, which is pecunia, and we noted, just as a simple example of philology, that pecus is a very old Latin word for cow. And it's not insane to draw the conclusion that at a certain point in Roman history, the cow was used for money, as it is still in parts of this world, in Africa and Asia. History involves also empathy, not Cartesian rationalism. So Cartesian rationalism would be, once again, cogito ergo sum. All you can know is that you know nothing, effectively, because even your sense perception is off. Human institutions, for Vico, therefore follow discernible patterns, making history intelligible, even if not mathematically precise. So his understanding of science is broader than what we've taken it through the Enlightenment to be. In short, for Vico, history is the most knowable of all sciences because humans can understand the worlds we ourselves have created. Okay. And the core differences, before we get to a schema of Vico, is such. Descartes mistrusted history because it is empirical and dependent on fallible sources. Something, incidentally, that Ibn Khaldun spent a lot of time on. We looked at his, I think, seven, SCVEN, 7 ways that history is distorted. Vico elevated history because it is the human world, and humans can truly know what they themselves create. All right, so we see that fundamental difference there. And getting back to the title of this initial set of remarks, lightning and thunderclaps. I was going to have some fun with this, but I don't think StreamYard or Google or Facebook or what else do we post on? BitChute and Rumble. I don't think they allow titles as long, much less as unintelligible as this. Incidentally, to understand this smushing of letters here, incidentally, James Joyce, the Irish modernist writer, makes a lot of use of Vico. He both begins and ends Finnegan's Wake with a nod to Vico's historiography, which we're going to see laid out visually momentarily. And on the opening pages of Finnegan's Wake, he tries to describe in letters a thunderclap, and that all together cycles around. Now, of course, Finnegan's Wake for James Joyce is also a modern setting of the Odyssey. And that's going to be very important to understand Vico, to understand, as an example, how is he an anti or a non-Enlightenment thinker, is the fact that Vico will make a lot of use of mythology. So what you see here is an attempt to capture the sound of a thunderclap as it rumbles along. So what does that have to do with Vico? Well, here is a very, very convenient schema of how our man sees history. In many respects, it's quite classical. We can see something similar. This looks like 4 separations. It's not quite because of this one here at we'll say 4:30 at this lower right-hand quadrant on the screen. Chaos, thunderclap, and in Italian, the ricorso. This is almost the interlude, but in terms of human society, Vico sees 3 stages, which reminds us of Plato's idea of the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of bronze. Here for Vico, we have a period of chaos I'll explain the thunderclap in a hot second. And that leads into a theocratic, divine understanding of time, or what Vico calls the age of gods. Eventually, that will develop, and in a sense, again, a very dangerous word to use, uh, very anachronistic word, perhaps. That will eventually secularize into a heroic age. Um, that will eventually develop into or devolve. So Vico, here's also a very, very classical understanding of history. And we're going to see this again with Spengler in a couple of weeks. History will be devolving into a democratic, individualistic, that might be a better use of the word than people, that we see here in this, let's say, 130 quadrant. A democratic, individualistic society that will lead to chaos, and then that leads, once again, rinsing and repeating. So we have here, especially if you've followed these broadcasts and you've been in the class, in the seminar section, you should notice this tension when we come to historiography between the linear conception and the cyclical conception, and maybe a certain synthesis, maybe I won't say a Hegelian synthesis. Certainly we see it with the Christians, and to a certain extent the Muslims, where history is, once again, like a spring or like a screw, where it is both cyclical and linear. Obviously, Vico is a Catholic. I don't think you're going to get out of that in the 18th century in Italy. There weren't that many Protestants there was actually a Protestant movement in Italy, but they didn't last very long. And you're certainly not going to have any sort of atheist movement getting going. So Vico, has these very, very ingrained Christian ideas about the parousia, the second coming, as it's called, eschatology, all of that, and yet it goes in a cycle. And being a Catholic, even that is kind of baked into the liturgical cycle. In every year you go through, in a sense, the birth and life of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus, and yet you're moving through time as well. So both of these are present. Now, getting back to the prevailing Enlightenment that Vico is writing, in a sense, against, or he's running against the current of, someone like René Descartes is going to have, a very linear understanding of history altogether. And again, René Descartes and the whole Enlightenment would be the matrix, the womb, W-O-M-B, the womb of liberalism. And as mother's milk in this maternal metaphor for liberalism is the idea of constant progress, not cyclical progress, constant upward progress. Sometimes at a certain point, all the time, we would call this Whig history. And this had to do with a certain school of thought in English writing. We don't need to digress into that. But this idea that all of history is leading up, is constantly progressing, constantly evolving, and constantly perfecting itself. René Descartes would be very much on the ground floor of that sort of liberal idea. For Giambattista, because of his type of Christianity, possibly, I suggest more than possibly, because of where he's living, he's seeing, here we go, he's seeing, again, the cyclical nature of history. Once again, to the opening remarks of these, of this class, right? He has the example of Magna Graecia, which comes, gets big, fades away. He has the example in the same plot of turf of Rome, which comes, gets big, fades away. Has the same example of the Naples Republic, the Nepalese Republic, comes, gets big, fades away after the fall of Constantinople / the New World discovery. You can't, given the wars of religion and so forth, not see a similar type of cycle of, Christianity comes, it grows, it in a sense conglomerates, and then it decomposes at his hour. Also, I'm not too big on dates, but it is worth bringing up. 1668 is his year of birth. And 1648, just one generation before, you have, I believe, one of the most important events in Western history. That it's the the most famous person you never heard of, the most famous event you never heard of, and that's the Treaty of Westphalia. 1648, it's the end of the 30 Years' War in Germany. And what you have in that year with the Treaty of Westphalia, just 20 years before Vico, is literally, and I think this is, if we're going to psychoanalyze the man, which I don't think he would be so much against, given his anti-enlightenment angle, or contra-enlightenment example. What is the Treaty of Westphalia? What is this major event that happens within spitting distance of Vico's life? It's literally, as I say, the transfer of one priesthood to another. After the 30 Years' War, one of these Reformation wars, it is literally the end of the Christian priesthood running Europe and the beginning of the legal priesthood running Europe. The 1648, 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, why it's so important is it's the beginning of the modern secular nation state where attorneys will now be the new priests. There was a time in Europe, when the priest said, you have to fast today, you listened to him. You didn't want to run afoul of the Inquisition. In the modern world, who are the priests? It's the attorneys. Nobody F's with the attorneys. Nobody messes with the attorneys. Those are the true priests since 1648. And we can all talk a big game, but everyone respects the new priests. And there will be another priesthood that will replace them. And maybe in this course, we can have that discussion. But the point is, I would add, in addition to the Greeks, the Romans, the Naples Republic, I would add also within the lifetime of Giambattista Vico, the example of Christianity growing and then collapsing in modernity, and then also this switchover, therefore, from the cardinals and bishops and priests running as administrators the nation states of Europe to secular attorneys. I would argue that all of this is contributing to Giambattista Vico's historiography. So once again, getting back to this schema, you have this reoccurring chaos, this return, this ricorso, and then he has this whole very mythological. This is, you can see, is contra-enlightenment, because Battista, points out if history begins with writing, well, people are communicating and events are happening before writing. So there has to be some recourse to mythology. So maybe not mythology, because I already defined that term. There has to be some recourse and some accounting of the prehistorical, the chaotic, we would say the mists of time, the pre-written. There has to be some accounting, because even on the Enlightenment's understanding of chaos to progress, you have a prehistory that we all know things happen before people began writing things down. And so for Battista, or for Vico, Giambattista is a much better last name. It kind of sticks in the mind better than Vico. But for Vico, you have this age of chaos, this prehistory, this mythological age. And then for him, he has this whole meditation on language and religion, where there is a thunderstorm. And people, prior to this, did not speak. And then at some point, we would say cavemen began trying to recreate the sound of thunder. And so in all of this, there's a very um, almost psychoanalytic attempt to recreate. Well, when does history begin? When do people make a split? And this is so crucial to understanding Vico and his whole cycles idea. When do people begin to make a split between, non-civilization and civilization, between non-history and history? For Vico, it happens with this, this lightning storm in prehistory, and people try to recreate a sound. And that's why James Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, a modern literary example, was so taken with this. Meaning, why does this matter? Why should any of this matter when people try to replicate the sound of thunder for the first time? Because that is the split between, shall we say, reality and art. It's where men, for Vico, this is the first time where men try to replicate the natural world. And from this, Vico says, from this lightning strike comes the gods. And so you see this association in various religious pantheons, pagan, Christian, and Jew, so to speak. You see this association with the gods and mountains and thunder and the heavens, right? Whether that's Jupiter or Yahweh or the Norse gods, there's all of this association with the gods and the heavens. And so for Vico, that's not for nothing. It's not for nothing that all across the world, the peoples of the world all have their mythologies connected to celestial events of attention, like a thunderstorm. And he really plays with this. And you say, well, that's very speculative, but is it any more or less speculative than, maybe not Descartes? I'm trying to find his mug here. He's nearly as ugly as I am. Okay, put it that way here. Turnabout's fair play. So Rene Descartes' ugly mug. The Enlightenment has this whole idea of the state of nature. Again, why? Because you can't remove historiography from the events at the moment. You can't remove philosophy from the events of the moment. And the reality is, Western man is all of a sudden coming across peoples he never even knew existed, including in the so-called New World. And that leads in the Enlightenment to this whole idea of the state of nature, from whence will come liberal democracy. Eventually, we'll have the likes of Karl Marx, and he will take that whole idea of progress in a whole different direction. Well, the state of nature upon which the entire Western world is predicated, from child rearing to education, I can tell you, with pedagogy, that is a major aspect, going back to Rousseau, a contemporary of, well, no, Rousseau's a little bit later than Descartes, but certainly influential in the modern world, just like Descartes is. Well, that's all very speculative as well, the whole state of nature. And then, mankind was in this state of chaos and had to agree to primitive governments and religions in order to staunch the short, brutish, and chaotic life, as Thomas Hobbes says, to paraphrase him, that prevailed in this so-called state of nature. All of this, the very fact that the mainstream Enlightenment has to appeal to speculation, all of this, Vico would say, kind of buttresses his point that there has to be this accounting of the chaotic. So winding things down for this initial presentation, and then we'll take a break and then come back for our seminar. Chaos. Eventually, there's a thunderclap. There's an event where mankind splits between just the chaotic now and trying to make sense of things, between art and nature. That leads to the theocratic, the divine, the gods. Now, here's something new as I recap this. Uh, for Vico, also, this is why we can see there are echoes of previous scholars here. Remember Augustine, right? Go back. You can, if you don't remember Augustine, you can go back to our doc site. You can see the previous opening remarks. And here's literally an illustration, right? This is how one scholar informs another. Augustine had this whole idea of the 6 ages of the world, which parallel Genesis 1 and 2. And on top of that, Augustine added the 6 ages of the Bible, where, day 1, God creates, you're going to put me on the spot here, back to Sunday school. Day 1, God creates light, right? Let there be light. And for Augustine, that's going to be paralleled to the story of creation. And then God's going to create, forgive me, I forget. I'm just going to go off the pictures here. He creates the heavens and the earth. He splits the heavens and the earth. Again, Vico's going to love this, right? And there are echoes of all of this in Vico. But Augustine, will parallel the splitting of the heaven and the earth to the time of, whatever, Melchizedek to Abraham, and so forth. And then on top of that, Augustine will lay over what he would see as the 6 ages of the church, from the apostles to, whatever, to the end of the persecutions, from the end of the persecutions to the rise of Charlemagne, which was, I'm just throwing that out there. That's not Augustine. Charlemagne was after Augustine. But the point is, you get the idea. It's both chronological and cyclical. And Vico, he will see as much. And what he will do is point out, that's always the last tab that I want, as you know. It's always the last tab, right? He will say, look at the bottom part here at what would be 7:30 p.m. Look here where my cursor is. He will say, paralleling the theocratic level of society, where the gods are ruling everything, coming out of the thunderclap chaotic. That is a parallel not to the Holy Bible, not to the time of the church, but to the human cycle of birth. Vico likens this stage to birth. And then at 10:30 in the morning on this cycle, you have the aristocratic age, leaving the theocratic. The age of gods gives way to the age of semi-gods, heroes like Homer's characters of Ulysses or Virgil's Aeneas. And for Vico, this is pure Vico, that will be marriage. Right? That's interesting. So marriage is a move away. You grow older and you go more real. You go from the age of the child, which is, completely mythological. Your father might as well be 10 foot tall, might as well be 100 foot tall. You don't have to worry about anything when you're a child, right? The gods, your parents, take care of everything. Now you're married. Now things get real. It's the aristocratic. It's the halfway house, though, because you're still, if you're married, not to get too sentimental, but right, I mean, you still have once in a while, gaga goo goo love. You still have, I'm told, magical moments of childbirth and fun aspects of raising a child, but it's also tempered with, your wife's a pain in the head most of the time, and your husband is as well, and your child is, for all the sentimentalism of Hallmark and all the Christmas commercials we have to deal with now, the child is not this magical creature most of the time. There's a few sparkles of the cool parts of parenting, but having been a teacher for 20 years this year, the child is mostly a shit, much like adults are most of the time. Okay, and then you move to what would be, I guess, 1:30 in the afternoon on this cycle. The aristocratic eventually gets so real, it becomes democracy. Everyone gets a say, and the individual. I would substitute, if I were to make this, I would substitute the word people with the individual or individualism. And interestingly, for pure Vico here, that is analogized to being the burial stage of a civilization. This is very this is very Platonic. Plato and the classics, and prior to the Enlightenment, did not have a very high opinion of democracy. Democracy was always the last gasp before chaos. And for Vico, that's because individualism gets out of control. It throws off the balance of power. And we can get into all of this in our second half, but ultimately you have the ricorso. You see this last section here, right? The ricorso, the return to chaos, the return which will invite once again a thunderclap, and it all begins again. But what finally, 10 different conclusions. What makes Vico also unique, and this is something we will see with Toynbee, is also different societies will have different. There will be shades of difference here, so it's not quite as uniform as St. Augustine or Ibn Khaldun. It's not quite as diverse as we'll see with Arnold Toynbee, that there will be more options at play explaining this cycle. And I think we can even see that here in the schema, where there are, in a sense, 3 or 4 gears to understand the same realities here. So with that, we conclude the initial remarks of this 4th installment of the Sons of Issachar course, and we'll end the recording and take a little break there. So Valete, for those of you joining us in the recording, thanks for watching.